Hi, this is Andy. So, have you ever heard someone who speaks kind of like this, like literally using the word like a zillion times in every sentence? I mean, it's like the worst. And they use the word right at every sentence, right? I mean, it's like horribly wrong. And oh well, someone ought to do something about that, right? Yeah, I recently overheard a conversation in an airport. It's almost exactly what it sounded like. And though it's easy to make fun of, I think a question for us as leaders is how much does this matter for us? I mean, how does the way that we speak help or hinder our ability to lead? So, a publisher recently reached out to me about a book that was soon to be hitting the shelves. It's entitled, check this out, Like Literally Dude, and it's written by sociolinguist Valerie Fridland. The subtitle is Arguing for the Good in Bad English. I love that. And Valerie joins us today to do just that. In today's discussion, Valerie will give us some perspective about why language changes and where those changes come from and why it matters to us as leaders. If you've ever heard that you need to get rid of all filler words when you're presenting, well, Valerie will add some nuance to that advice. Along the Along the way, we'll learn about intensifiers, vocal fry, and more, all with the intention of helping us all become more effective communicators. It's a fun discussion that I can't wait to share with you. Hey, quick question. Are you feeling overwhelmed at all by all the buzz around artificial intelligence? It's hard to miss this constant stream of announcement about new tools and capabilities. What's not always clear is how these technologies can actually benefit us as leaders of teams and projects. That's why my team and I have developed a new e learning offering entitled AI Made Simple, Practical Guide to Using AI in Your Everyday Work. This online course is specifically designed for leaders like you who want to harness the power of AI to enhance your business tasks. Whether you're looking to stay ahead of the curve in the fast changing world of business, streamline your workflow, or boost your productivity, AI Made Simple is a great starting point for you. So don't miss out on this opportunity to learn practical strategies for leveraging AI in your everyday work. For more information, make sure to check out the show notes. Let's jump into today's discussion with Valerie about her new book, Like Literally Did. Valerie, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today.
I've been looking forward to this. If I didn't know better, I think I would have assumed that linguists are people who know lots of languages. And as I learned your book, that would have caused an elevator full of linguists to laugh out loud. Okay. So, what are examples of how you respond when someone says, so, Valerie, what's a sociolinguist?
Well, that's funny because a lot of times people do assume I speak a lot of languages. And I think, probably the best answer is I know enough about other languages to order a beer in those languages. And that's pretty much probably all you need. But a sociolinguist, besides liking beer in all languages, also studies beyond the superficial structures of language. And by that, I mean the words that we're using and the sentences that you might understand if you go to a foreign language. What a sociolinguist or a linguist more generally of the type I am studies is the underlying structure. So, what
Mm,
psychological abilities do we have? What physiological abilities do we have that make language work?
mm,
And my particular interest as a sociolinguist is how do those psychological and physiological abilities interact with our social identities and sort
mm.
of the construction of sort of social values, cultural beliefs, and the like. A
Yeah.
good example would be, I think, a simple one is the word darn versus damn.
Mm,
To just everyday speakers, we don't think much of that alternation, but it's very much socially driven.
mm,
The tendency that you would have to choose darn versus damn is going to depend on social facts that are static about you. So
mm.
things like your gender, your age, and maybe even your ethnicity, these things might vary. So, you can see sort of, well, some grandpas might be more likely to say damn, but my grandpa would have been more likely to say darn it,
Mhm.
something very mild, whereas
Right,
my
right, right.
son is probably more likely to say damn. So those are static facts. But then
Mm,
even the same person that might be more frequently likely to use darn instead of damn, when they hit their hand with a hammer as they're nailing something in, might say damn because it's an expression of intense emotionality, and
mhm.
a darn just doesn't purvey that emotion.
Yeah.
So it's both depending on who you are socially and also the context in which you find yourself. So all of these things, the physiological, the psychological, and the social, are the types of things I study in language.
That's so interesting. I did not grow up in the South in the US, and before we started recording, you were mentioning that you did. I didn't know that when someone from the South says, "Oh, bless your heart," they didn't mean some sort of blessing on you. But there was some things about local culture there, about ways something gets said. Like it wouldn't be as common for them to say, "You're an idiot," right? But
Right.
but there's like words that are said, and it can vary, right? I don't know if that's a great example, but that's one that come to mind.
Well, bless your heart is definitely a, oh, you poor idiot kind of nice way. It's very polite. And, we have this belief about Southerners that they tend to be more polite and hospitable. And a lot of times we encode that in our beliefs about their language. We
Mhm.
also have these unfortunate beliefs about people from the South that they're also less they're more ignorant and lazier than people from other
Mhm.
regions. And you can see that in almost every stereotypical movie,
Mhm.
where that represents dumb people, right? They usually are somehow Southern.
Mhm.
As a Southerner, part of my interest in language was how come we have these beliefs about
Mhm.
what Southerners are like? And also my parents were not native speakers, and I found that
Mhm.
Southerners had a lot of beliefs about what non-native speakers were like. So all of that comes together and makes us have these cultural values and beliefs that we put onto the language that people speak. And I think Southerners are definitely very aware of it. And bless your heart is our kind way of saying, excuse you.
Right. Hey, and for anybody outside the US, they maybe don't know this nuance, but uh, other countries have their versions of these things as well, right? The way they
Absolutely.
say things. Oh,
Absolutely.
that's not proper English, or that's not, or they're from that tribe, or whatever. Right? We've got our own versions of that in different countries.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I loved how you include the heritage of some words and patterns. And as much as my grandparents may have railed against the way that young ones speak these days, I'm interested, why is that language changes, and who can we look to in order to get an early read on what the next changes will be?
Well, language is definitely different today than it was in the old English times. And if you've
Mhm.
ever tried to pick up, Beowulf,
Right.
or a poem, an epic heroic verse from that era, you would know that you couldn't read it. So
Right.
obviously things have changed a lot. So it's kind
Mhm.
of funny that we get so worked up about language change, since
Mhm.
obviously it's part of the natural evolution of language. In fact, if you look at the history of English, it is a Germanic language, but it's not from German, it's from Proto German,
Mhm.
which is the same proto language that spawned both German and English, as well as other languages like Danish and Faroese and Norwegian and the like. So we can't say that language doesn't change over time, because everything else, the fact that we have so many different languages that are Indo-European, that are Romance languages, that are Germanic languages, tells us that they do change.
Mhm.
The funny thing is that we dislike it when it happens in our own lifetimes, but we accept it
Mhm.
fully when it's happened over centuries. So,
Right.
I think the first idea is, well, language change is inherent in the system. There's obviously
Mhm.
something about the way our psychological apparatus, our physical apparatus, and our social world interact. And through contact with other languages, through just natural inherent tendencies that we have in language, which are kind of complex, but we can get into later,
Mhm.
these changes sort of naturally evolve in our language. But when they
Mhm.
meet social forces, sometimes those social forces have weapons. Other
Mhm.
times they have just snarky teenage attitude. Then we notice them more because they're
Right.
rapid and they
Mhm.
sort of are intense. So I'm sure when the Normans came over, it was noticed. Oh my gosh, there are these people with swords facing us down, and they speak a different language. And lo and behold, they took over and threw this whole language into our royal court and our government.
Mhm.
So that was a
Mhm.
drastic change that was observable. But
Mhm.
even before that, just contact between different dialects of sort of Old English varieties and the Northmen who spoke Old Norse, which was a related dialect to Anglo Saxon,
Mhm.
those really subtle interactions actually caused pretty massive changes even before the Normans came over. So
Mhm.
just by talking to people that are different than us, but maybe slightly different, we get these really subtle shifts towards a sort of composite dialect, so that if you speak something that's similar to what I speak, but not exact, and I speak something similar, but not exact, as we talk to each other, we'll move together.
Mhm.
And that will cause a process of what's called leveling, which means that we'll kind of get rid of these differences when it's not important. And that way we can communicate more effectively. So it's all about efficiency. And that's really what
Mhm.
leads to language change.
Oh,
In terms of
interesting.
those that start it, well, you just look in sort of the communities around you and look who we blame for language change. And that gives you your answer right there, right? It's
Mhm.
usually the
Mhm.
young, It's usually the
Right.
female, and it's often those in sort of marginalized communities or ethnic subcultures.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It totally makes sense. It's intriguing. I think this is related to what you said, that linguistic differences come about anytime we have separation, and I think that's really profound. And so, what do you mean by that, and why does that even matter to us?
Yes, actually, that's such a fun way to look at language that I think just sort of flips it on the head the way we usually think about it. When we think about differences in language or language change, we usually think it's because someone's doing something wrong.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
speak correctly,
right.
they've screwed it up.
Yeah.
That's usually the way we look at it. But actually, language differences arise because of any kind of social distance. And that can
Mm,
be distance that's enforced because of geographic barriers. So, regional differences, the way that Southerners versus Northerners talk, a lot of that was from historical and geographic separation. And obviously, in 1600, you couldn't just hop in your car and drive up to New York
right.
to visit your kin. So it just was a different kind of ability to get around in communication networks at that time. So that was social distance brought about by geographic distance. But then you also have social distance that is related to people in the same place that have differences in the way they believe things, differences in where they come from, differences
Mm,
in the color of their skin, whatever causes social distance to arise. And all of those things, all of those fissures in social space make us talk more like those we identify with, or
mhm.
talk more like those that we spend a lot of time with daily than those that we tend to be separated from for whatever reason. And so that's what I mean by social distance and
Mhm.
social fractures creating language differences.
There's so many profound. I didn't expect to get these profound insights. I thought it'd be interesting reading and things like that. But the fact that identity comes, you can detect identity through language, and I think it's kind of related to that. Whereas if I might be talking to someone and they use the word equity more often, I might pick up on something about their beliefs, and I might make bad assumptions. But if someone goes, "Oh, what a blessing," I might think about some implications of those words of identity, and I never really thought of listening to words, and we probably actually do it more than we realize, but consciously listening for identity, and that could
Absolutely.
kind of put us in different buckets, so to speak, and that's, I suppose, part of separation. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think what's really fascinating is that we do this anyway, but we
Yeah,
just don't recognize explicitly that we do
yeah,
it. We hear somebody say a word, and obviously that can tell us something. So, if my daughter comes home from school, she's probably going to say things that are very different than I might say.
yeah,
I have a couple of teenagers, so I hear a lot of words that are not native to my
yeah, yeah,
dialect. So
yeah.
that automatically sort of triggers me to recognize her as someone from a younger generation. And we don't
Mhm.
realize that that's a social assignment when you're making on the basis of language, right?
Yeah,
Thinking,
yeah.
oh, they're separate from me in some sort of way they conceive of the world because of their age is assigning them a social identity on the basis of something they said. But even more subtly is what I find really fascinating about language. And I think what we really don't consider is how these tiny little differences, not even in just words we choose, but in the way we say things, in the
Mm,
forms of, our past and progressive participles, for example,
mm,
that is incredibly socially meaningful. It's not
yeah.
just words, it's tiny little details.
Yeah, yeah, I love some of the little exercises you had in the book about even the 12 days of Christmas, of how I would say some of the words. And there's just little subtle things that, like, you just you actually we pick up on them. We just don't think about them in the same sort of
Right.
way. So I just thought it was intriguing from that standpoint. I feel like just about everyone listening to us has probably taken a presentation skills class, or maybe they haven't gone through Toastmasters or something like that, but they've gone through enough training or read enough articles on it that they know it's generally accepted advice. Get rid of filler words like ums and ahs. And I'm interested for your take of why that seems to be so, universally accepted advice. And more important to me would be why you think we ought to be a little bit more tolerant of these filler pauses.
Well, I think the reason it's so universally accepted advice is because we tend to look at things from the sorry, let me start over. We tend to look at things from the perception of what people will think of us when we say them, rather than the science of what they do for us as speakers or listeners. And we very rarely actually go study any kind of manuals or scientific literature on what does this speech feature do for us. But what we do pay attention to is what the general consensus is from people that we know or people that we take classes from about what people will think of us if we use those features. So we base a lot of our behavior on what people are going to perceive about us, rather than what the reality of linguistic science can tell us about how to use those features in a successful way for cognitive benefit and for articulatory benefit. So this is a case where you have social identity and social beliefs on one hand, and you have linguistic benefits, physiological and psychological benefits on the other hand, and they're not always aligned. In fact, often they're not. So I think it's that we've looked at them from two different perspectives, and that's the problem, is we haven't really had anybody tell us, well, that's actually not based on any kind of scientific validity. It's based on just the general belief that we have that people don't sound good when they say these things. And I think a lot of times it has to do with our perception that when people and they're not prepared, or they're more hesitant about what they're going to say, which is really funny because it's actually somewhat related to what the value of and are in our speech, but it's a misunderstanding of how they're valuable. So just to make it a little clearer, so when we or we're doing it before areas of greater complexity, and that's usually something like more difficult vocabulary, more unfamiliar vocabulary, less common words, more abstract words, more difficult to describe things. So if I have a squiggly shape instead of a square, it's harder to describe that squiggly shape than the square. You're going to be more likely to and before that. Same thing with really complex sentence structure. If you make a really long sentence with lots of complex phrasal embeddings, it's going to be more difficult for your brain to process that. It'll take it longer. And therefore you or more than when you're saying a simple statement with 3 words or something. So it's really based on cognitive processing and processing load. I take it as a good sign that my brain is working harder, right? When I
right. That's a good
But
point.
you were going to say something?
Well, I was thinking, my understanding from the book is I might also put more of those at the beginning of a sentence because I'm trying to form the sentence. And so it's just a sign that someone's thinking.
It's right. And that's why I think that's the crux of why we think of them as hesitant or uncertain, is we are uncertain in the sense that we're formulating, but that doesn't mean we don't know. And there's a key difference between being hesitant because you're working on it and being uncertain because you don't know the answer. And I think what happens is we conflate those two. So while I'm forming my answer, that simply means I have a lot of work to do. I have cognitive retrieval. If I have vocabulary words that are not stored right at the tip of my tongue because I'm not using them often, so the neural networks my processing has to go through are a little more complex. It's going to take longer for that to happen than a word that I use every day. So I might say dog all the time, but not canine very often. And I'm more likely to before canine than dog for just that reason. So I think what happens is we misconstrue or at the beginning of a sentence as they don't know the answer, when actually what it means is they're working on the answer. And so I think we're just quick to judge. The other issue I think with public speaking is and uhs do come up more often when we are less familiar with what we're saying. And that doesn't mean we don't know it. That just means we haven't practiced it as much. And when we practice something more, we actually and less. In fact, there were some interesting studies that had someone describe a photo or describe a picture, and then they had them re-describe it later. And they found that on the second description, they used fewer uhs and ums than on the first one because they had already been through it in their brain and they didn't have to activate those neural networks as much. Yeah. Well, that doesn't mean they couldn't describe the picture satisfactorily. It just means they had to take a little more time at the beginning to do it. So when someone's giving a public talk, though, we anticipate they've practiced it. We feel like they should be confident in their knowledge about it, and therefore they should know it without having to have any cognitive work to do it. So I think it's sort of fair to say that when someone's giving a public talk that we think should be practiced and rehearsed, we have more reason to judge them on those uhs and ums simply because we anticipate they know that material better than an or a might indicate. that doesn't mean it's a negative thing. And some people are just heavy ummers. And even if they've practiced it, boy, had they not practiced it, would have been nonstop and but now that they've practiced it, they're doing it less. So I think we need to be a little more careful about when we judge people for this. And in a business meeting, when you're just, fresh off, the plane and trying to anticipate what you should answer, we shouldn't expect people not to and If I'm a CEO of a company and I'm giving the annual talk at the, corporate meeting, I should probably know what I'm going to say and have rehearsed it, and therefore and less.
I like it. Something I've been working on is the I'd say the silent pause of, just go silent instead of the what am I going to say next, and trying to do that. But I think it's also context, because in a presentation that can maybe be more effective, but in a conversation, one of the things I took away from your book is that silence is a signal time for you to jump into the conversation. And so the or the is kind of a way of saying, well, wait a second, Valerie, I still got some more to say, right? Where in a presentation it may be different. So context, is that right?
Absolutely. And if we study the pattern of where ums and uhs, or filled pauses is what they're called, where filled pauses tend to occur, they're much more likely in spontaneous conversation than in lectures or storytelling, because when we're telling a story, we anticipate people understand when we're done and we're not, or you're a very bad storyteller. So I think that is partially it. We use them effectively to sort of give ourselves processing time, but we also use them to signal to a listener, hey, wait a minute, buddy, I'm working on this, and back off from my turn. Because when we pause silently, what we're doing is giving a turn transition cue, it's called, that helps a listener know when they can jump in a conversation. And so you can misconstrue a silent pause in conversation as being an invitation to jump in. So or an basically tells your conversational partner to back off for a moment.
I like it. It's so subtle. And that's why sometimes I feel like over Zoom or Teams meetings, because it can get laggy, sometimes even just, I imagine it's milliseconds sometimes of just this little gap there of, oh, Andy wants to say something, or Valerie wants to say something, and trying to learn to read those. These are just cues to kind of help us understand.
That's right. Actually, Zoom is interesting because it does have a internet relay delay. So you actually, I can't even remember. It's like 20 to 50 milliseconds difference than in spontaneous speech. But that very subtle difference that doesn't seem like a lot of time actually messes up how we sync up cognitively with each other. There was an interesting study done on syncing between conversational partners. And because of the delay over internet, we can't sync as effectively, and therefore our brain has to work harder to kind of figure out what the other person's going to say, because that natural flow of conversation we have in person doesn't happen. That delay just messes up our sort of neural circuitry that communicates with the other person's neural circuitry and kind of gets in the same rhythm. And that is why you feel so tired after a Zoom meeting. Is part of it is, you're smiling and trying to do everything with your face because they can't read your body language.
Right.
But it's also simply because your brain is actually working harder to sync up, because that natural rhythm that is established in regular conversation can't happen over Zoom. And I think that's often why people sort of maybe even start a sentence with or online more than they would in person, because they're not quite sure what's going on. It's sort of everything's thrown off just a little bit. Zoom is a fascinating area to study people's conversational behavior, because it definitely makes us a little more formal, and I think a little more guarded about what we say and how we say it.
So interesting. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing it. I mentioned in the opening that I overheard a conversation in airport about, a third word it felt like was like. So could you give us a sociolinguistic history of the word like, and why we maybe don't want to just write it off as bad grammar?
Why we don't want to dislike
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Like is such a fascinating word because it has such intense emotionality behind it, in the sense of how we either love it or hate it. I think the key is we can all point to someone we've heard, like you did, somewhere, sometime, that uses like so often that it's distracting. But if you look at the general way people use like in the average population. It's not that extreme. And so if we discount that very extreme case where, granted, I think all of us would find it distracting, the majority of people that use it in very purposeful ways to fulfill a void that was in our language previously. And it has been a way that we've been filling that void for about 300 years, which I think surprises most people. We think of it as a Valley Girl feature,
right?
But actually, if you look back into the 1700s in some colloquial transcripts that we have, of course, literature doesn't tend to show us colloquial features as much as diaries or letters. Or the internet today, which obviously we didn't have 300 years ago. Fortunate for them, and maybe misfortunate for us, or unfortunate for us today. Right. But what we find is in trial transcripts from the Old Bailey proceedings, which were criminal court trials in Britain in the 1700s, we find them easily written in all different shapes and sizes in those transcripts. So we see like as a discourse marker and like as a discourse particle, in addition to like used as a verb and a preposition and a conjunction. So even though like appears in its traditional context, we also find it appearing at the beginning of sentences and in the middle of sentences, much like we do it today. What we don't find is quotative like, which is where like is used instead of the verb to say. That, people are correct, is a very new way that we're using like. And that's when you use it to sort of indicate an evaluatory or sort of personal perspective on what you're quoting or what you're thinking. So if I might talk about two people at a party, I might say, well, John said he was going tomorrow. Or I could say, well, John was like, he doesn't know if he's going tomorrow. Where one would give you the impression that that's exactly what he said. I'm reporting to you exactly what John said. The other would tell someone who was listening, well, he said something like this. It wasn't exactly like this. This was my impression of what he said. Another good case for when we alternate between say and like in that way is when I'm talking about what I was thinking. So I didn't actually say it. It's not verbatim. And when if I say, I said, John is a friend, you would take that as a verbatim quote. Okay. But if I say something like, well, I was like, I think John's a friend, that's telling you, this is what I'm thinking. This is my cognitive processing and my sort of subjective sensibility about John. And it indicates this sort of impreciseness of meaning, and not in a bad way, but more basically like you're supposed to get this as a gist, not a verbatim quote. So that's a pretty new use. It's really only been coming around in the last 30 or so years. And it seems to be the most fast growing use of like today. And that one, even though people don't like it, it clearly serves a purpose that was not met in the language before. With say, you can't discriminate between those two reasons, those two purposes. But with like introduced, you can actually alternate between these different perspectives where I can talk about what someone said and use the verb to say. And I can reflect on it and talk about what I was thinking by using the verb like. So it allows this extra flexibility in language that I think we miss when we just dismiss it as useless and flighty.
So good. And for those listening, that's just an example of one word in the book that you get to learn the rich history of and the nuance of it. So Valerie, thank you for going through. I appreciate that, because something that to me is just absolutely horribly, wholly, completely and totally annoying are intensifiers. Okay. So why are intensifiers so tempting to use, and maybe there's value there, beyond hyperbole? Any thoughts?
Well, think about how boring your speech would be if you didn't use intensifiers. How would you ever describe a meal that was delicious, or a particularly good friend, or a spouse that was amazing and you loved them X, right? You didn't love them so much because you just love them. How boring is that? If my husband only ever said, I love you, I'd be like, not enough. Okay, pump it up, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
We need to be hyperbolic in some context, because life is about sort of being emphatic and being excited and sharing that excitement. And the way we do that is intensification, which, for people that may not know that term, it's things that we put often before adjectives, adverbial modifiers that boost them or ramp them up. So very is sort of the grand dame of intensifiers, but things like terrifically, awesomely, completely, totally, or so, or pretty, those are all intensifiers. And we'd be boring if we didn't intensify. And in fact, if you look at communication research studies, we are boring if you don't use them. They're actually considered to suggest that someone is more certain and more sociable than someone who doesn't use them.
That's interesting. Is there identity ever tied to intensifiers as well? Can you ever pick up on identity on that?
Absolutely. I mean, think about some of the intensifiers that young people use, and it would be really kind of weird if I walked around and said, "Yeah, that's hella awesome, man." Right? You have this sort of really strong association. So young intensifiers tend to be often different than older intensifiers, and one of the reasons for this is intensifiers are one of the most rapidly evolving areas of English, and they have been through history. So if you look back to Old English, which I think is really cool to watch the intensifiers over time, the intensifier du jour of Old English was suive, which actually meant strong originally, but became used even in the Old English period to mean extremely. So you'd be going up a suive high hill, which meant a very high hill, not a strong high hill. And then we had well, that was well good, for example. Then we had fair, he was fair, happy. Very happy would mean that, or, you know, if it was done fairly, it was sort of that same kind of idea. Then we had, let's see, there was well, there was fair, there was right, a man right fair, which would mean very fair, a very fair man, very handsome man. And then we had pretty for the first time it came around, and then pretty went away and very became most popular. And then recently really was very popular. That's fairly recent. And now really is being overtaken by so. Which seems to be led by women. So another aspect of identity there is not just youth, but gender. So what happens is young women are sort of the vanguard of language, and they tend to do things faster and pick up new forms faster than anybody else. So young women usually lead language change. So what we think of as very effeminate features are often just features on the cusp of becoming the new forms of our speech. And so is sort of the new female intensifier, which is why so is very gendered. So a lot of times people think women use so a lot, but so actually is simply the up and coming intensifier. And if we look at young men and young women, young men actually in many cases now use so as much as young women. It's really older speakers that tend to vary. So can be found to often typify women's speech, especially when you talk about people over 30. And so there you're getting a gender read off of it. So if someone keeps using so a lot, it might make it seem, if you saw it written, you might assume it's a female that's writing that. So we have these really interesting unconscious aware sort of ways of being aware of who speakers are based on these really subtle differences in their speech.
Yeah, I love it. You know, I remember when there was a lot of talk about Elizabeth Holmes and how she intentionally worked to get her voice deeper, more masculine, if I remember right. That was kind of the implication, if not say. I don't remember hearing the term vocal fry, though, during that time. So how would you describe vocal fry and maybe some of the controversy around it? And we have a lot of women that listen to our podcast as well, but I think men could learn from this. What should we keep in mind about this when we're trying to communicate?
Well, yes, with Elizabeth Holmes, a lot of people were very critical of her low-pitched voice, sort of saying that she'd put it on and it wasn't her natural voice. So I think a lot of the criticism of Elizabeth Holmes, and whether this would have truly happened had she not been accused of criminal activity, I don't know, but was this idea of authenticity and what your authentic voice is. And we have these really strong associations with pitch and social identity, as well as pitch and different attributes, things like being competent, being intelligent, being attractive, being credible, being trustworthy. We actually find these ratings decrease or increase depending on the pitch that people adopt. And most studies seem to associate credibility, intelligence, and competence, and certainly authoritativeness and dominance with lower pitched voices, which is probably why Elizabeth Holmes, if you assume she did alter her voice, adopted a lower pitched voice as the CEO of an up and coming company. But with vocal fry, it's slightly different. It's also an attribute of low pitched voices, but instead of being just a full on low pitched voice pitch throughout the whole way you talk, vocal fry is actually a little extra excursion into low pitch that you're making from your normal pitched voice. So I can give you an example. I think that's the easiest way to describe it. You would say something towards the end of the voice like this, and I'd have that kind of cracky popping noise. in my voice, that sort of a staccato, scratchy sound like this. And where we find it usually happens as at the end of sentences. So I might say something like that, or you can kind of just hear it come in. So it is low pitch, and it's a very low pitch, which is why it has that irregular pulsing noise, because when you are making a really low pitch, it means your vocal folds are not vibrating as fast. So if you really slow them down, it's kind of, they start doing this wavy thing that's really irregular, and it gives that little popping noise that we hear as vocal fry. So it is tied to low pitch, but it's not the same as just adopting full on low pitch. And what we find is women have adopted it more and more in professional settings, particularly in news or broadcast settings. We find women over the last 2 decades or so have been showing more of a tendency to hit low vocal fry than men, even though in other countries, sometimes men vocal fry more than women. So it's certainly nothing pathological. It's simply a way of getting more of a low pitch nuance in your voice. And if you step back to think, well, what are the pressures we put on women in workplaces? They want to be considered authoritative. They want to be dominant. They want to be competent. And I mean those as good attributes, which is what we tend to assign CEOs and leaders. But if you have a high-pitched voice, what you get for that is, oh, she's attractive, right? Oh, she might be a good mate, but not, I want to put her in charge of a company. And that seems to be the really strong associations we have with high-pitched voices, is that they're more attractive on women, but they're not considered as competent, as trustworthy, or as dominant. And that can, I don't mean dominant as in I'm going to beat someone up, but social dominance. And so what's a woman to do in a professional workplace? Adopt slightly lower pitch at the end of sentences, namely vocal fry, to give off that more professional, authoritative air. And this is how young women generally hear vocal fry. If you ask young women what they think of vocal fry, they tend to think of it as very urban and very professional sounding. Of course, older speakers tend to have a different opinion.
Yeah. You know, the story with Ira Glass in the book I thought was interesting. Would you mind sharing that? Because he does it and no one complained about him, right?
Right. So Ira Glass, of course, is the host of This American Life, which is an NPR show. And they had so much hate mail, loads and loads of hate mail about the way women sounded, the women journalists that he had on the show, the way they sounded, their voices. And while they had complained about a variety of things in women's voices, the latest thing that people disliked was vocal fry. And in fact, some of the emails, I have them in the book, are pretty insulting to
like growling,
women.
The growling women, wasn't there something like that?
The growl in her voice was so horrible, I had to turn it off. And do they interview the worst possible women for these jobs? Things like that. Just hatred about these women's voices. And it was vocal fry that really had garnered a lot of the attention, so much so they had a special episode devoted simply to vocal fry and the hate mail they received because of it. But if you study Ira Glass's voice, you find that he actually vocal fries quite a bit. But no one had ever complained about his voice. And he actually comments on that he vocal fries and no one has ever complained about it. And in fact, other shows have reported the same problem, that women get called out for using vocal fry when the same shows and the men on them don't ever get called out for it. So I think what we find this suggests is it's not the feature that we dislike, it's the women's voices not being what we expect or we have historically come to like in those positions of power, in those broadcast situations where we expect a low-pitched voice from a man, that causes us to police women's voices in those contexts.
It's fascinating. I did a search because I think it was in your book about Kim Kardashian uses it, or maybe I had read some of the, but anyway, I did a quick internet search and there's one clip on YouTube that just has like the end of her sentences vocal fry, and you listen to it and you're like, ugh, that's terrible. And yet, so this is why I love about many things I love about your book, but we're not looking at something as good or bad. It's just what are ways to look at it this way and look at it that way. And is it something that could help you, or is it something that's getting in your way? Right? So you're not trying to overuse vocal fry, realize that there are trade-offs of how it's viewed, but you might want to consider it too, right? I mean, is there something there?
Right. And most of us aren't Kim Kardashian, right? She basically makes her billions off of being outrageous in some ways, being exceptional in many ways, exceptionally good or exceptionally bad, however you like her, but she's definitely stands out. So I think, when we use a celebrity like Kim Kardashian, or any of the Kardashians for that matter, to represent what we think most women are doing, it's probably not accurate to what most women are actually doing. Most women don't use vocal fry to that degree. But the purpose of it probably drives her desire to use it in her speech for the same reason that the rest of us do it in our speech, is to sort of get that urban, relaxed, because it also gives off this sort of a relaxed sense,
Mhm.
professional, capable woman. And that's the aura that she uses it for. And she just does it maybe more than most other women. But also, we don't really generally take women's voices and then just play the last 2 milliseconds of their
Right.
speech over and over. So in a
Exactly.
conversation, you're not going to have that read of a vocal fry the same way that people that are looking for it and trying to make fun of people will do
Mhm.
it in that regard. But yes, I
Mhm.
think what we need to look at it as is something maybe you do, maybe you don't do. But instead of judging people based on your own perspective of that feature, maybe step
Mhm.
back to evaluate, what do we know about this feature and why might it be positive for that person? It
Mhm.
may not be positive for you. You may not
Yeah.
want a vocal fry and it may not do work for you, but
Yeah.
it does work for somebody else. And those people are going to be in charge of the world one day.
Yeah.
And vocal fry won't be a thing anymore. So
Yeah.
just because it tends to be a younger feature, I think we often look at things with suspicion. But in actual fact, we find that low pitched voices tend to get women in professional settings a little more sort of sense of being capable, being professional. And why wouldn't women want to adopt that if that will get that for them?
Yeah. It just reminds me of is vocabulary helps because when you have a word for something, then you can see it more easily. And so I will look at that all differently now because I read your book and I'll be watching for it. Did it work? Did it not work? And so there's many reasons why I think people can get value out of just that section. But this is really a question beyond the book, Valerie, is people listening to us, they just want to be better communicators. So whether it was in the book or not, if just a couple of your top takeaways as what you've taught and what you've researched for as a social linguist, we can be more effective when we're trying to, let's say more specifically in a meeting when we're presenting, as opposed to like a one-on-one, let's say, or a casual conversation at home or something like that. If we want to be more effective communicators, just a couple things off the top of your head.
Okay, well, that's a really good question because I think a lot of times we jump on advice that we read in books or on weird blogs that we don't really know the background of, and we're like,
Right.
let's try this in our speech. But if we look at science and
Yeah.
we look at studies, we can find that there actually are some guides that can help us in professional contexts. One thing is meetings are a very different place than casual conversation. And I think it's
Mhm.
really important to understand that we have a repertoire. And what I mean by that is we all speak at different ranges of what we think of as normal in different contexts. So, one example would be I have a chapter in the book on walk in versus walking, that
Mhm.
ing ending. Well,
Mhm.
obviously, we all say walk in sometimes and we all say walking other times. And what does it signal to us? Well, one is sort of a signal of intimacy and informality. The
Mhm.
other is a signal of formality and maybe stiffness. And that's appropriate in certain contexts. So I think we need to get over feeling like anything is always right all of the time. And what we
Mhm.
need to do is say, okay, this is situationally determined.
Yeah.
And I have a range, and it may not be the same range as everybody else because my background, my social identity will sort of determine the edges of those ranges. So, what's my most formal and least formal speech? What's my most standard and least standard speech? And if I shift into the correct sort of part of that repertoire for the speaking event, then what we should look at is whether someone's doing that to a degree that makes them sort of both communicative, successful, and able to connect rather than judge them for where that repertoire is. And I
Mhm.
think that's one of the key takeaways of the book. If I don't speak like someone else, but I am speaking in a way that sort of lends itself to sort of forming a bond between us, making a connection between us, and also being communicatively intelligible, which pretty much everybody's speech is, then I shouldn't judge someone for having a different norm than the one that I do. And if we can keep that in mind when we go to a meeting and realize, okay, there might be things in their speech that I don't love, but am I able to understand their message? I guarantee you are. If someone's
Mhm.
eyeing or umming, or if someone says like a few times,
Mhm.
if you spend too much time distracted by that and just letting that be your focus, like, oh my God, I can't believe that, like, what an idiot, I hate that person's talk, then
Mhm.
you're missing the message. And maybe that message is really important, really valuable, and offers a diverse viewpoint that you haven't listened to
Mhm.
because they come at it from a different view. They are in a different part of that repertoire than you, but that doesn't mean that's a negative attribute. And there are certainly times when you can say, listen, I really enjoyed what you said today. I found, you used like a little bit too much in a professional context. And in this particular environment, I think people might judge you for it. So I'm just wanting to make you aware of that.
Mm.
But I've heard so many nasty negative ways of managers calling out people for their speech. I have a friend that is a firefighter, and she sometimes runs an engine, and she has uptalk in her speech, which is a more typical of women's speech. And people take uptalk again to be uncertain, but that's only because it's associated with women's speech. Instead, uptalk actually is a cue of listenership. I'm checking your listenership. I'm sort of having listener buy-in, and I want your attention, and I'm not done. That's what uptalk actually says. So she's had several people criticize her uptalk in very painful, hurtful ways in front of other people. It's completely inappropriate, and that really makes you the asshole, right? I mean, that's not an appropriate way to talk to people. So I think there's two main messages from this. One, if you're self-conscious about your own speech, the book can provide some ideas about where these features tend to happen, and you can get a better perspective on why you're using them. And then you can decide based on your own values and beliefs whether that's something you want to work on. And when you know where they occur, it's a little easier to figure out substitutions for them. Like, oh, sometimes like comes up where we'd use about instead. So maybe I just switch to about. I think that's fine if that's your choice. The other thing is, I think as a manager or as a leader, what we can do is be more aware of these features being just something different than our own speech, and not being illogical, not being bad, not being ungrammatical, but just being an evolutionary process, and what's sort of the up and coming next generation. And if we value connection and communication and community, I think that's the way to look at it, as being a way to have an open door to have better communication with others, and try to cross those generational divides.
I love that. That's beautifully said. So big message: be less judgy. And there might be
Yes.
learning in this. The other thing that comes to mind, I'd just be interested in your take on this, is I had the opportunity to talk to Sylvia Ann Hewlett about her book Executive Presence, and one of the things she says about appearance when you present, she doesn't say you have to wear this versus that. She goes, just don't let your appearance be a distraction from your message. And I feel like that's kind of this here, right? Don't let the right, like I just said, don't allow the ums and ahs be the distraction. If that's what they take away, did you hear how often he said that? Then it's something I need to work on. But did they get the message? That's the key. Does that seem like a reasonable way to think of it? Just the way we're speaking, don't let it get in the way of the message we're trying to get across.
Right. And I think that's a two-way street. So
Mhm.
I think we have to be aware as speakers of how things in our speech, even though they're completely valuable and culturally fine in different contexts, might be distracting in certain contexts. So if I tend to and a lot, then it might be something I need to pay attention to. But it's also on the other side that when we're letting ourselves get distracted by those speech features, and then we're dismissing what they have to say because of something we don't like, we're also doing something wrong, right? We're doing
I like it.
actually more wrong, because what we're doing is not listening to the message because of the way
Mhm.
it's delivered. And then we're at a loss. So I think both sides are absolutely true. And one,
I like that.
just last piece of advice I give people is, for example, if you probably don't know how much you use these features unless you record yourself. So I always suggest, if people are interested in what their own linguistic style is, because we all have one, record yourself having a conversation. And this is particularly easy over Zoom now.
Mhm.
And then go back and listen to it afterwards. And don't cringe at, every little thing you do, but notice if you have certain things you lean on. And a lot of us do. So you brought up at the very beginning the right that people put on the end of the words. I've had many people tell me that that is something that they notice in their own speech, or people have commented on in their own speech. And actually, right, again, is a tag question, and it is checking for listenership. So there's nothing wrong with it. But if you tend to use it every sentence,
Right.
then people can often focus on that instead of what you're saying.
Mhm.
So that would be something you can say, okay, I'm going to try to say what I just said that I recorded myself saying, and do it without the right, and sort of get used to that feeling. So there are ways that you can actually use that type of knowledge of where things occur to help you improve in terms of how you might want to, have it more of an executive presence. But I
Mhm.
think the heart of the matter is these are just preferences and not bad things. And I hope that people take that away from the book, that this is all about just being sort of sensitive and recognizing that we differ and that those differences are okay. But yes, I think you can say probably that you want to dress up and look the part, and you want to speak up and look the part.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. There's so many things I'd love to talk to you about. Let me end with this. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. Can you think of some ways that you and your husband have sought to help your son and daughter be more effective communicators? Anything specifically that parents could take away?
That's just funny because I have two teenagers, so
Right.
that requires communication happens at all. It's just
Right.
not always the case. No, truthfully, I'm very lucky. I have a really wonderful kids, and what I have taught them, and I think different than most parents, as a sociolinguist, I study what they say. So
Mhm.
they actually tend not to say things in front of me because I'll, instead of telling them not to say it, I'll be like, wait, I'm going to write this down. Tell me exactly what that means, and then I'll try to use it. Right. I was like,
Yeah.
what do you think of my fit? And my daughter's like, I'm going to burn my ears. So I think it's a little different. And maybe that's an approach. If parents are worried about the way their kids talk, just show really good interest in trying to copy it, and they'll never say it in front of you again.
Yeah.
But what I found with my children is I've taught them the lesson that context is everything. And I love the way they communicate with their friends using language that is appealing to their social identity formation. And adolescence is fundamental to establishing the norms of the future. So you may not like what they're saying, and some of it will go the wayside, but some of it will become the norms of our future, and that's okay.
Mhm.
But then I also tell them that you need to be conversant with people of a different generation and make sure that you are asking them questions, right? It's not a one-way street, and trying to use the end of your repertoire that shows them that you also recognize that this is a more formal situation. So we've worked with our kids on how do you talk to adults, because a lot of kids don't know how to answer adults, they don't know how to converse with them. And I think more than what you say, in terms of features, it's important to know how to have a conversation. And, I think anybody would be happy to have a 16-year-old talk to them, even if they use a few terms that maybe are a
Yeah.
little hipper than what grandma's used to.
Yeah.
And I feel like my kids are really good talking to adults because we've tried to put them in those contexts and make them do it several times. Now, they don't necessarily always like it, but they are very effective speakers when it comes to adults. And both of them have actually given public presentations, which is another thing I would suggest. If you can ever get your kids in front of a microphone and make them have to explain themselves without doing some of the kid tricks to not talk, that's a very good way to get them to learn to speak in public.
Mhm. Oh, so good. Well, for those listening, I trust you've enjoyed this conversation. If you'd enjoy learning more about the past and future of our language, get a copy of Valerie's new book, Like Literally Dude. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Valerie, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Absolutely. It was really fun. Thanks for having me.